Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll get started.
This story begins in the year 107th according to the continental calendar, namely when Rajesh II and his new queen declared themselves to be real gods, and they even overthrew the most revered crown prince of the empire just to seize power. So in this way, a real coup d'etat took place in that place, with bloodshed and many victims. And the queen and thief, who was the founder of 3 fallen houses among the 10 great families on the continent, came to power and staged a real bloodbath. This battle was waged against 6 houses in which she was constantly treated with contempt. The girl awakened those who were in despair and on the side of the prince. Thus, she awakened all these people to plot a rebellion. However, the strangest thing was that the instigator of the rebellion was none other than the half-brother of the son of the deposed queen. This man's name was Durian, and he was indeed quite a powerful man. A girl with blonde hair was sitting alone in prison, and the guards who were supposed to watch her so that she didn't escape suddenly became very angry. They started yelling at the poor girl, asking what she wanted, and also saying that she really was a witch, who had even been thrown into prison by her own brother. He also said that even drowning would be too severe a punishment for her. The girl didn't answer at that moment. She just sat there and smiled, because she found out that no one knew that her life-threatening plan was for the house of Solmia and Duo. Then all 3 of them suddenly heard footsteps behind them, and then a man's voice asked what all the fuss was about. When the guards turned their heads to the side, they immediately saw Lord Durian in front of them and were very scared. The girl herself, whom everyone considered a witch, also looked up and really saw her half-brother in all his glory. Durian was a really young guy with blonde hair and a very muscular build. He was dressed in an expensive military uniform and was accompanied by several knights. One of the guards immediately asked him for forgiveness and said that they decided to talk to the queen because she suddenly started singing for no reason. The girl at that moment immediately jumped to her feet. She ran to the grate and grabbing it, addressed Durian. She looked incredibly happy and kept shouting that she was so glad he had finally come. She also named him the new head of the great house of Solmia. The girl smiled and thanked him for coming to her at least for the last time. She also called the man her dear younger brother and looked at him without taking her eyes off him. Then Durian turned to everyone else. He suddenly felt a little sick, but told them all to step aside because he was going to deal with this crazy girl himself. As soon as the queen heard this, she immediately became happy. She told her brother that she was really happy, and also that she wanted him to come closer. When the man approached her, she quietly asked him to throw her aside so that everyone would believe. Durian immediately pushed her so hard that she lost her footing. The man suddenly started yelling at her like never before and telling her to shut up already. He also kept calling his half-sister crazy. The man was very annoyed by the way she called him, so he told her never to do that again. Durian also added that he was really surprised how such a heartless person like her could seduce the king in the first place. Continuing to shout, he said that he now saw that she was a temptress who was capable of speaking with a sweet voice. Durian wondered if she had spoken in the same tone when she had asked the new head of the family for the death of her younger brother. He also said that the girl had once despised him for not being legitimate, and now dared to beg him because she could not part with her miserable life. He was disgusted even to think about it. The girl, when she heard all this, could not understand what he was talking about. After all, his face was frozen in an expression of disgust, and she could not believe that her beloved little brother was standing in front of her now. Of course, in her memories, the girl knew him completely differently. He was like the warmth of the sun, which she had never met before. Durian made her blood flow even faster and thus destroyed her icy heart. Simply put, he was absolutely everything to the girl, and she did not understand how he could now say such words. She was still lying on the icy floor of her prison. When Durian finally fell silent, she said in a trembling voice that she had sent him a letter. The girl still could not comprehend her fate, and said that she had already told him that all this was just a pretense for the sake of him and his family. She immediately remembered one thing he had done, and wondered if that was the reason he hadn't sent her a flower. She thought that was exactly what had happened. The man, very angry, asked what she was talking about. In what letter and flowers? And Durian also said that she gave him goosebumps. The man raised his voice at his sister again, saying that he had never received a single letter from her, and therefore came to the conclusion that she was simply trying to control him with her evil tongue. Adelaide at this point began to cling to the bars in order to get to her feet, but she had too little strength to do so. Her brother meanwhile began to turn around and leave, saying that it was with her that his suffering began, and there was not a single moment when she did not despise him. So Durian, angry, waved his hand and said that it would have been much better for them if they had never met at all. Then perhaps she would not have ended up in this place. Before he left, he said that he wanted to say goodbye to her forever, and also added that she had become a disgrace to the three families she had held so dear, and now it would only be a great relief to them when she was gone. Of course, Adelaide couldn't believe that all this actually happened, because before her brother was completely different. In fact, the girl, in order to give him a strong family, became a girl of easy virtue, whom everyone knew as the king's mistress and a bloodthirsty witch in front of everyone. Of course, she did all this despite the fact that she didn't like it, and Adelaide did it only to help her beloved younger brother, and he ended up paying her back in a completely terrible way. And even on the day he allied himself with the crown prince and dethroned her, Adelaide felt nothing but pride for her handsome brother, who had finally achieved success. So now all these words incredibly hurt the girl who did everything so that her brother did not feel alienated and strange, perhaps even wrong because of his origin. However, in the meantime, another man suddenly began to descend into the dungeon. He crossed paths with Durian and asked if he was sure he wouldn't regret it. This person was the dark-haired Sirius Morska. He also said that it didn't matter how much the boy hated her, because she was still his sister even after such a massacre. So Sirius thought she should be given at least one more chance. Of course, Durian got mad about all this and started yelling at him, saying that he never considered her as such. He explained to His Highness that this woman was a criminal who deserved only death for her actions. Therefore, when leaving prison, he asked that all punishments be carried out as intended. Durian also said that he must act according to the law of the land if he wants to earn the trust of his people. After that, the guy left without saying a single word and without even regretting the decision he had made. Sirius stood there for a while and thought about what would happen to the girl now. He also thought that the fact that Durian constantly avoided his gaze meant that he shared his feelings. After this, Sirius finally went down to the dungeon and, seeing the girl, greeted her. Adelaide didn't even bother to look up at him. She only asked in a pained voice if he had any last caustic remarks for her. The guy came closer to her bars and heard the girl saying that he would have enough opportunities for his revenge that evening. Therefore, she would very much like him to leave her alone in the meantime. Sirius just stood there for a while and was silent, looking closely at the back of the girl's head, because she still hadn't raised her head. Then he put his hand, which was wearing a red glove, on the bars and said that he had no thoughts of revenge. All he felt was remorse. The man also added that she, of course, could not be happy, so he did not understand why she was pretending to be a very happy person, because it was immediately obvious that it was all just a pretense. In a rather friendly voice, Sirius said that he had no intention of letting her die like that. As soon as Adelaide heard these words, she could not believe their truth, so she raised her head and decided to finally look at her interlocutor. The man meanwhile stuck his hand into her cell and offered to run away with him. Of course, Adelaide did not consider all these words to be true, because she knew perfectly well that this could turn out to be just a trick or a new mockery of her. There was complete silence in the dungeon for a while. She looked Sirius straight in the eyes, trying to figure out if he was serious. Her whole body began to tremble, but she tried to calm down and suddenly raised her head, asking if he really wanted her to run away with him. The girl was beside herself with rage and said that she had set him up for betrayal and even tried to poison her, but now he was suggesting that they run away. Sirius knew exactly how this sounded, but he ignored her words and said that he wanted to ask again if she would run away with him. Having calmed down a little, Adelaide asked in a quiet voice why he had to resort to such nonsense, now that he had finally realized his dream and become king. She really didn't understand what benefit Sirius would get from all this, but the man, his voice trembling with emotion, said that it was all because he loved her. The guy couldn't even hold back and shed a few tears, and then asked her if she really thought that he didn't call her his stepmother simply because he hated her. In fact, Adelaide's first meeting with Sirius was quite anticipatory. She was already quite grown up, and her father was going to conduct rather interesting negotiations with Sirius. When the man arrived at their estate, he said that he wanted him to meet his stepmother and the new queen, and also to make sure that he would always show her the utmost respect. Sirius, coming closer, immediately bowed and told his father that, of course, he would always show her respect. In fact, Adelaide, as soon as she saw him, immediately thought that he treated everything differently than the stupid king she married. Sirius bowed before his new stepmother and said that it was a great honor for him to meet her, and also that he had been waiting for this day for a very long time and was glad that it had finally come. In fact, if it weren't for Sirius, Adelaide would have chosen the usual path, giving birth to a child for the king and creating a new heir. In the dungeon, Sirius said that he never wanted this throne, and the girl was so blinded by her ambitions that she did not even notice his feelings when he was nearby. Adelaide was so shocked by everything he was saying that she screamed and told him to stop. Continuing to speak loudly, she asked him to stop, and also said that this was just a terrible act of betrayal towards her. Of course, the guy was so brilliant that Adelaide took on the role of the villain and tormented him all the time. Eventually, This prompted the king to simply throw him out of the estate and prevent him from inheriting the throne. The girl, continuing to scream, asked how he dared to love his stepmother romantically, and also asked if the 10 great families knew what a lecher he was. Adelaide certainly knew that this would only further irritate her brother. However, she had no choice. Sirius looked at the girl and said in a sad voice that it was completely unimportant, and also added that her only desire was to become a queen, and she never loved his father. That's why he wants her not to give up, because he is the only one who can help her get out of this terrible place. Adelaide then began to approach him and told him to listen very carefully, and asked him if he knew what it was that she despised more than the lowly common people. Without waiting for an answer, the girl said that it was precisely him. He was the reason why her child could not inherit the throne as a legitimate heir. She continued to look at Sirius and, laughing, said that if she could, she would tear him to pieces immediately. However, he wanted to offer her to run away with him to an unknown place and for an unknown amount of time. She asked in a surprised voice, would he really hide her and force her to live in silence when she had wanted power and attention all her life? Adelaide also wondered if Sirius really wanted her to just be stoned to death by everyone when they found out she had escaped, or if perhaps he wanted to wait until one of them betrayed the other. The girl was already tired of listening to all this nonsense, so she would like it all to end already. Adelaide continued to scream loudly to attract attention and said that he was entangled in stupid illusions and remained the same small and naive prince, despite the fact that his status had completely changed. The girl said that his father promised to give her the continents, and now he's in a really horrible place, right in the grave. So she thinks that the two of them are a really charming duo. Of course, the guards had already heard these screams, and they immediately ran to help Sirius and also told the witch to finally shut up. And so some time passed from that moment, and the day came when Adelaide was to die. They gathered at the lake near the estate, where a boat filled with flowers was brought to the shore. As Adelaide began to slowly enter the boat, one of the guards, holding a torch in his hand, approached her and asked if she had any last words. The girl was silent for a while, and then, smiling, she threw a transparent cloth over her head and said that she got what she wanted. However, she doesn't know anything else about why she lived all this time. Before she finally got into the boat, she looked at her brother and Sirius and wondered what she had been looking at all these years. The girl was in despair and could not understand why the man she valued more than her own life, Durian, saw her only as an enemy who needed to be destroyed, while the man she considered her lifelong enemy claims that he loves her with all his heart and was even ready to save her from this fate. All this remained a mystery for the girl, to which she could not find an answer. At that moment, the guard suddenly pushed her boat away from the shore, saying that the execution could begin. This boat had to sail to the middle of the lake, and then one ritual had to be performed. As Adelaide slowly floated towards the middle of this very lake, she thought that the one who tried to save her and help her, and the one who wanted her to die but could not see his true nature, were now together behind her. The girl considered everything that happened to be a rather strange ending, and also thought that if she ever had another chance to live this life, she would like to do everything differently. At that moment, when she had already reached the required point, without thinking twice, she jumped off her boat and fell straight into the water. Because she had been given some kind of sleeping pill earlier, she was unable to swim out. However, immediately after her consciousness faded, it awoke in a new body. Adelaide screamed very loudly, and this scream brought the maids running, who were very frightened. They ran to her bed and asked if something had happened and if she was feeling unwell. One of the maids even explained that she didn't wake her up only because she went to bed late. Adelaide at this moment knew perfectly well where she was. She looked at her hands shaking from panic and could not believe that she was still alive. For the girl, all of this was really very surprising, and she even suggested that, most likely, she had simply dreamed it all. Following the maids, Madame Harris, who was Adelaide's main teacher, suddenly entered the room. She turned to her student and said that she was probably just having a nightmare, and added that this was the reason she advised her to always stick to a regular bedtime. Adelaide, hearing the familiar voice of Madame Harris, immediately looked at her with a very surprised expression on her face and did not even say hello. The teacher, meanwhile, said that she needed to pull herself together and finally get ready, because she absolutely could not miss the history lesson that was scheduled for this morning. Adelaide, hearing about the history lesson, immediately remembered that all these events took place 12 years ago, when she was still very young. She asked in a trembling voice if this meant that she was now only 18 years old. She also realized that she had somehow been reborn into her old self. Madame Harris did not like all this at all, and she said that no matter how disturbing her dreams were, it was improper to scream and lose her temper in the presence of her maids. Adelaide, sighing heavily, said that of course she would try to be careful, but she remembered very well those cold eyes, which were always filled with insensitivity. Her teacher turned to the girl and said that a portrait artist was due to arrive that afternoon, so she had no time to waste. She had to have a quick breakfast and then start her lessons to get everything done. Meanwhile, the maid brought a huge wash bowl. Adelaide wanted to say something, but did not have time because the maid interrupted her. She looked a little surprised, but said that her name was Lucy, and also added that she had been assigned to look after the mistress. So now she would be around all the time. In fact, in Adelaide's past life, Lucy was a servant who remained loyal to her until the very end. No matter how much she was bullied, she always stayed by her side. It was truly amazing to Adelaide that such a servant could remain faithful with such unwavering devotion, for she had never met such people before. Lucy, holding her mistress's hair while she washed, said she had put the book on genealogy that Adelaide had been studying the previous evening in the study. The girl thanked her for this, and thought to herself that except for Mrs. Harris, a distant relative of her father, she had never bothered to meet anyone in the castle. Now, looking back, Adelaide couldn't believe that she had actually lived such a cold and lonely life, without communicating with anyone. But then the girl suddenly remembered what her teacher had said about the history lesson, and she immediately realized that this was probably the very day when something amazing was supposed to happen. In her past life, when Adelaide came to class, Mrs. Harris said that she should learn not only about their empire and neighbors, but also about her father's family. The teacher believed that the girl should know about the maternal line as well. She was talking about the territories that remained under their control and was about to continue the lesson, but Adelaide suddenly interrupted her with a question. The girl apologized and said that several days had passed since Durian had returned from Adbury. Then she asked why he could not attend the lesson with her. The teacher then became very angry and asked if the girl really wanted to be present at the lesson with the child. She added that there are levels in learning, so this is completely unacceptable. Adelaide wanted to ask again why Durian couldn't study with her, since he was already 15 years old, but she couldn't bring herself to say those words out loud. Meanwhile, Adelaide went to the mirror and started getting ready. Suddenly, she called someone an idiot. The maid immediately became frightened, apologized, and asked if she had done something wrong. But the girl answered Lucy that she was not talking to her, but was looking at her reflection in the mirror and talking to herself. Turning to the maid, she asked where the Durian was now. Of course, Adelaide had a hard time believing what was happening. However, she could not miss this wonderful opportunity and had to find out everything she had experienced and achieved in her past life. The maid who was adjusting her clothes downstairs immediately said that the man had returned to the outbuilding 3 days ago and was probably still there. Then Adelaide suddenly became very angry and asked how she dared to address him so carelessly since she had called him a completely inappropriate name. Lucy was very surprised when she heard this and immediately said that absolutely everyone around him called him that way, but she interrupted herself without finishing the sentence because she realized that she was saying something wrong. Adelaide looked at her maid with disdain and said in an icy voice that if everyone continued to treat her brother like this, their lives would be in great danger. Well, the girl wondered if Lucy could pass this message on to everyone else. After all, they should be aware of what could happen if they don't follow the rules. The maid was then incredibly frightened. She immediately told the girl in a trembling voice that she would take this to heart and also asked the mistress for forgiveness for behaving in such an inappropriate manner. Adelaide continued to look at her and told her to call the Durian immediately, because from now on they would eat together. After this, Adelaide went to breakfast and kept wondering who she could blame for the current situation. Of course, the girl knew it was her fault that she did nothing, even when she knew the Durian was being mistreated. Never knowing the origin of her blood, she didn't even try to find out how to express herself. The girl didn't have any independent hobbies that she could pursue. As Adelaide sat at breakfast, she turned to Madame Harris and said that she wanted to be in class that day with her brother, the Durian. As soon as her teacher heard this, she was outraged and asked what she meant. She also explained that there was an age difference between them, so they could not study together. However, Adelaide knew exactly what she wanted, so she said that the difference was only 3 years, and also asked if it was true that she had been hired to teach the children in their home. Mrs. Harris was incredibly hurt by this remark. She looked at the girl in surprise and said that, of course, this was her duty, so she agreed to make an exception, but only for 1 day. Adelaide, continuing to eat her food, thanked her for it, and also said that she was indeed very generous. In fact, the girl was like a stone that was incapable of knowing love or rejection. She could not blame the Durian for not understanding her, and for that reason harboring a grudge. But most of all, her misunderstanding concerned the topic of Sirius, to whom she showed no more love. But he still came to save her, and even said that he loved the girl. When she remembered the whole situation that happened in the dungeon, and thought that if this meant that she needed to express emotions, then perhaps now was the time she could do it. Unlike her past life, she now became more emotional and open and did not want to make the same mistakes as in the past. So when the door to the dining room finally opened, the girl immediately smiled and told the maid, who replied that Mr. Durian had arrived, that she would meet him. From that moment on, Adelaide decided to openly show her affection for her brother so that absolutely everyone could see it. However, how surprised she was when a small Durian walked into the room. He was wearing very wrinkled, dirty, and torn clothes, and his face did not bode well. In fact, the Durian was Adelaide's half-brother, whom her father Ahriman brought with him one day. Of course, everyone around was not at all delighted with all this, and even the servants did not want to treat him with respect because they considered this guy lower in status. And Adelaide's father, in turn, never stopped cheating on his wife. So the Durian, being an obstacle in his way, could not stay in the house he was in, and so he was relocated. Each time, the poor boy was sent to places like Castle Sirius or Avonbury, and these were not the most favorable places for such a bright child. As a result, there was no place where the Durian could be calm and feel good as an illegitimate child. Moreover, since Adelaide was the eldest daughter and was already being groomed to be the heir, no one treated Durian as the eldest son, despite the age difference. Despite the fact that the girl understands this perfectly well, she could not accept why in her past life she simply took and closed her eyes to his pain and loneliness. Adelaide, seeing him in a most terrible state, immediately asked what had happened, and told him not to say that the gardener had made him do his own work again. The guy sighed heavily and said that he had told him that he would do it because he had nothing else to do anyway, so he didn't see any problem with it. Adelaide looked at him with great surprise. The guy had a worried and distant expression on his face, and she did not understand why she never noticed the feelings that were literally written on his face. Durian, wiping his face with a dirty hand, decided to change the subject and asked the girl why she suddenly decided to invite him to breakfast. Adelaide, rising slightly from her seat, was very surprised at such a question and said that they actually should have done this much earlier, and also added that he quickly came up and sat down next to her. As soon as her teacher heard all this, she decided to intervene in the conversation. She started shouting loudly and asked how the boy could go to eat with such dirty hands, so she told him to wash his hands immediately before sitting down at the table. And besides, she was very unhappy that the Durian could sit next to her at the table. So she replied that the place for him was at the far end of the table, where he should sit. But Adelaide interrupted her loud cries and told Mrs. Harris that this would not happen. The Durian would sit right next to her. The girl, looking at her teacher, also said that it was the first time they had eaten together. So of course they could not have a full conversation with all the details if they were sitting so far apart. When Adelaide seated him, she said that the lady had not pointed out that the servants had brought out the food before everyone had sat down. And the girl asked the woman to make sure that there would be no more such inappropriate violations of etiquette because this was completely wrong. Of course, Mrs. Harris was incredibly angry. However, she reacted calmly and said that she would make sure that all the servants were well educated for the next time. After some time, the maids had already brought out all the breakfast on the table, and they also brought a wet towel for Durian so that he could wipe his face and hands. As soon as the guy saw all this variety of dishes, he was so surprised that his eyes even opened wide. Seeing this, Adelaide immediately smiled and said that she didn't know what his favorite food was, so she decided to cook a wide variety, and also asked what he liked the most. She explained that she wanted to know this so that she could prepare for the next time. As soon as the Durian heard about the next time, he immediately asked, "Are they really going to eat together again?" The girl looked at him and answered in a calm voice that, of course, now they had a lot of time that they should spend together. Durian, sighing heavily, looked away from her and said that the most delicious thing he had ever eaten in his life was boiled chicken with some kind of vegetable in hot water. Because he was too hungry, he pounced on the food that Adelaide served and said that he actually didn't know exactly what he liked, so he was ready to eat absolutely everything. Of course, the girl did not expect that the most delicious dish would be such a strange dish. Of course, despite the fact that he was an illegitimate child, she considered such behavior absolutely terrible and inappropriate. For a while, she just sat there silently and watched him eat. Of course, he hadn't researched etiquette and was throwing everything into his mouth without even chewing. Adelaide felt very sad to see this picture, because he ate so quickly that it even seemed to her that he was afraid that the food would be taken away. Her teacher at that moment was simply raging with anger because she really loved etiquette, and when it was not followed, she lost her temper. However, the woman had to restrain herself because she did not want to be scolded by Adelaide again. At this point, the maids who were standing behind immediately began to whisper among themselves. They were watching Durian and thought it was simply disgusting that he was eating fish with a steak fork and dipping bread straight into his soup, like a savage. They could not understand at all how a young lady could dine with such a lowly educated man, who even called himself a lord. Adelaide heard all this perfectly well, so she decided to take revenge on them, and specially took the wrong fork for the fish, and having dipped the bread into the soup, she began to chew it cruelly. As soon as everyone saw this, they were incredibly shocked. The maids were ready to rush and take the fork away from her, and her teacher almost fainted from shock. But the Durian, who at that moment turned his attention to the girl, was very surprised. He immediately realized that he was doing something wrong, but in this way she supported him. And so some time passed from that moment and a history lesson began. Mrs. Harris stood in front of the two children and said that on this day they would receive a brief overview of the 10 great noble families of Adau's level. The woman also said that since Adelaide was studying her mother's Grimoire family history, it was completely unnecessary for Durian. Then she began to read the material, saying that this continent is ruled by families, including the royal family in the north, east, and west. Adelaide, who usually listened attentively to her teacher, noticed that the boy was not listening to her at all, but was sitting and doing something with his pen. Mrs. Harris explained that in the east, there are blood pacts such as Host Simple and Malera, and in the north, there is Kanaka and Diera back under Death Dommel, and their family guards their respective regions. The north has always produced the finest fur on the continent, and the east has grown flowers like roses, and the high-quality tea they can find on their tables. The teacher also explained that the west itself is a key strategic area connected to the capital. It was ruled by high-ranking families who were close to the royal family in the Dawnstar region. Adelaide smiled at that moment and could imagine the look on Mrs. Harris's face if she knew that the girl had simply gone and destroyed all those families. However, the teacher continued the lesson. She explained to the children that all these people were in charge, but the methods of collecting taxes in their places were completely different. As soon as the boy heard all this information, he immediately beamed with joy. He quickly wrote it all down and said that it was amazing because when he wrote, the parchment did not tear. Mrs. Harris, as soon as she heard his admiration, immediately screamed and said that they needed to concentrate, because during classes, everyone should be very serious and listen only to her. Durian immediately lowered his head and said that he was listening. After that, he repeated the last phrase that the teacher said in order to prove his point. The guy also said something about the family in the west. He explained that he saw them in the main house in the capital. A squad of knights with silver armor entered the palace. Durian also replied that they said that the man in front was a knight from the Dommel family. He is the bravest and most courageous knight. So in conclusion, he smiled and said that it was quite an interesting sight. Adelaide, when she saw what he admired, immediately smiled and realized that this was a great opportunity to start a conversation with him. The girl turned to her brother and asked if he really liked stories about the good knight. If so, she had several. As soon as the guy heard that she called him by a shortened pet name, he was very surprised. But his stepsister continued to say something. The girl, in turn, said that they also had a knightly order, and she would immediately call Sir Oberon so that he could tell the guy a very good story about the battle. Durian immediately started screaming and saying that this should not be done, and he himself considered this day rather strange and did not understand why his sister was so kind to him. The guy then quickly turned to the teacher and said that he knew everything about this topic and asked if he could leave already. He explained that he still had to help in the garden, because he had promised, and he also had additional work that he had to do, so he couldn't just waste time. As soon as Adelaide heard this, she immediately became indignant. The guy had already gotten up from his seat and started walking towards the exit when suddenly she asked him to stop. In a rather sad, but at the same time friendly voice, the girl said that she was very worried about how he was living in general, so she wanted to go with him and see what was going on. Of course, Durian couldn't refuse her, so when the lesson was over, the two of them went to the place where he lived. As soon as the children approached the hut, which was located nearby in the forest, Durian turned to her and asked why she decided to go with him. He also added that her lessons had not yet ended that day, and the teacher was incredibly angry that the girl had done this. But Adelaide suddenly laughed and said that she must have realized that she couldn't do all the punishments she wanted anyway, because it was against the law, so she had to just rage in silence. When the boy looked at his sister, he was very surprised. He did not understand why she was smiling so brightly. However, they approached the house where he lived, and before opening the door, he warned her that it was a little messy. Durian kept wondering if this was really the sister he had known all this time, but as soon as Adelaide entered the house where the boy lived, she was so surprised that she couldn't even say a word at first. But walking forward, she suddenly began to scream very loudly, saying that this was much worse than the duty officer's room, and the girl really did not understand how they could have put him in such a terrible place. She wanted to know who did this, and she also told her brother to return to the main building immediately. She would definitely resolve this issue, and would not allow him to continue living in such conditions. Adelaide was truly furious. She knew perfectly well, even in his past life, that he was being treated badly, but she couldn't understand now why she had never visited him to see the conditions in which the boy lived. She wanted to scold herself, but she held her emotions in as best she could. And besides, Adelaide had always thought that he understood perfectly well why she hadn't done it. But now that she had seen the end of her past life, she concluded that it was not so. Durian, as soon as he heard her words, immediately started screaming and said that he didn't want all this. The guy explained that he prefers this building, no matter what house he was in. It's all the same. He just wants the girl to let him live in peace in this place and not kick him out. But Adelaide didn't even listen to him to the end. She quickly ran up to her brother and with tears in her eyes began to hug him very tightly. She didn't understand how such a sweet child could be so unloved by absolutely the entire world, and also how she could not notice this loneliness. Adelaide hugged him, cried, and asked for forgiveness. The girl could not understand why they grew up next to each other, but did not even realize that they were equally lonely. The girl asked him to forgive her. She said she was too ignorant to understand the situation he was in. She said that from now on she would give him absolutely everything he wanted: clothes, books, a room, and asked if he would eat with her now. The guy didn't understand what was happening at all. He also burst into tears and said that he agreed, but only asked her to let him go and give him some air. Durian didn't understand how his sister, who had always been like a cold gemstone, was now standing next to him and hugging him, saying such wonderful words of support. When the girl finally let him go, he hung his head down and said that he didn't need books because he couldn't count because he had never been taught how to. At that moment, Adelaide was horrified. She remembered her brother's words, which he had shouted at the time, that he had never received letters from her, and also believed that she had always mocked him. She couldn't bear all this, so she burst into tears again, because she understood that this was her big mistake. Letters he couldn't read, even if he got them, would just hurt him even more. The feelings she couldn't express, foolishly thinking about loneliness, were now eating away at her from the inside. Adelaide couldn't stay on her feet. She fell on her knees and started crying loudly. Durian was shocked and asked her to calm down. The guy also said that if the workers found out, they would treat him terribly and think that he made her cry, so he asked her to calm down and stop crying. For a while, Adelaide gave in to her emotions, and then she realized that her beloved brother was her only family. And just as he had once saved her from loneliness, from that moment on she was going to protect him at any cost. At this very time, Prince Sirius hid deep in the forest from everyone he knew. The man wanted to be alone. The guy's assistants started looking for him and told him to come out, because in this way, he could simply burn down the entire forest, and this would definitely not do him any good. Then one of the knights, even shouting, said that the king was calling him. If the guy was late, it could reflect badly on him. Sirius, who was sitting quietly on a tree with a book at that moment, turned to his assistant and asked if Julian was really planning a rebellion, since he was talking about burning the royal forest. The man who was looking for the boy was the second son of the Donmel family, Princess Cedric's bodyguard. As soon as the boy heard the prince's words, he laughed and said that he would not have answered anyway until he said something like that, because this was the most important place for him, and he wanted to find it. At that moment, Sirius began to climb down from the tree and said that even if it was a joke, it was a great disrespect, because the forest is a living, breathing, huge organism. Julian approached him and said that so be it, he would not speak like that again. However, that was to be expected from the Prince of the Forest. After that, he replied that they should go now, because Lady Merle Kale was already waiting for them. Sirius suddenly stopped and looked at him seriously, asking if she couldn't just send the portrait. He didn't understand why she had to come in person. Julian immediately remembered that the guy had lied then that he had a high temperature and refused to visit, and now he was very worried, so he hurried into the forest as quickly as possible. But his friend and bodyguard asked him to meet her without making her worry so much and wait so long. The guy also said that when it comes to a young lady from a host family, he can't just turn them down. Sirius, adjusting his uniform, said that she had come to ask him directly, stating that she had not received his handwritten letter, and wondered if this was true. The bodyguard was very surprised and indignant, said that if the man did not meet her after she had gone all this way, he would be criticized for mistreating the lady. But Sirius wasn't interested in that at all. He said it was even better than punishing himself for not being dependent on women, like some people. Julian pretended not to understand what the guy was talking about and said that the place left by the departed queen was still vacant. The prince sighed heavily and replied that this was precisely why he had to follow his father's orders. His bodyguard began to urge the boy on and told him to hurry up and change his clothes. Julian also said that besides all this, he thought that His Majesty would personally congratulate him on this day. And as soon as Sirius heard this, he was so surprised that he even stopped. And so some time passed from that moment. The guy returned to the estate, changed his clothes to more festive ones, and coming to his highness with a smile on his face, asked if he had summoned him. After bowing and greeting, Sirius also apologized for the inconvenience that Lady Marilee Kale had caused, and explained that he had simply been feeling unwell. His highness laughed at this point and asked if Sirius even realized how rude that was. But he also asked him to sit down quickly, because the young lady from the family had brought some precious Augustinian rose tea, and he simply had to try it. The girl, as soon as she saw Sirius, immediately stood up from her seat, and running up to him, said that she was incredibly glad to meet him, and also asked if his fever had already subsided. It was Lady Rose of the Marilee Kale host family, and Sirius, as soon as he heard this, immediately smiled and said that his condition fluctuated, sometimes better, sometimes worse. He also said that he was genuinely surprised when he learned that she was so worried, and added that she was a very kind person. Lady Rose, hearing of this, positively beamed with joy, and said that she had heard it from his highness, and all the women of the capital were, of course, worried about the prince and his condition. But at that moment, the man who had invited Sirius to the meeting cleared his throat to attract attention, and said that he would be leaving them. So he asked Sirius to take care of entertaining the young lady. But before leaving, the man approached the guy and asked how long he intended to avoid the topic of his marriage. The man said in a very serious voice that she had come straight to visit, showing her sincerity. And Lady Rose was quite a good match for him, and he asked Sirius if he thought so. You won't get an answer. He also said that Lady Ramarant treasures her, so he shouldn't do anything rude. The man also answered that he married Sirius's mother only because he loved her, and it is precisely for this reason that he still leaves her place vacant, so that he too will need to find the same kind of marriage in order for true love to be present in it. Before he left, his father told him that he had to choose a woman he really liked. He also added that portraits of other young girls would arrive very soon. Sirius said that he really appreciated his attention. After that, his father just left, and the guy had to go back to this Lady Rose and somehow start a conversation with her. Of course, he didn't like all this, and he was also skeptical about his father, because for someone who claims to have had a marriage full of love, he had too many mistresses, even if his mother was alive. Sirius stood outside for a while, then he came in and Lady Rose poured him a cup of hot tea. The girl, smiling happily, said that indeed his eyes were as deep as the green of the forest, as many had said. She also said that if she were to give him a precious stone, it would definitely be an emerald or a peridot. But then, thinking about it, she said that perhaps a bright green garnet would even suit him. Sirius tried to be polite, saying that she looked more suited to receiving jewelry than to giving it. The man had as many as 3 candidates for the title of Princess Consort, and among them all, the most influential was the eldest daughter of the Northern Terrier family. However, Sirius perceived the sudden assignment of personally greeting and entertaining the daughter of his host family as pressure from the Eastern Steward, Lady Rimenard. At this very time, Julian, who was standing behind the door and began to spy on Lady Rose, was surprised that Sirius, who was not at all interested in women, could treat them so well. The man watched the beautiful girl as she giggled at the stupidest joke the prince could possibly make. Then the guy, looking closely at her beautiful cherry-colored hair, elegant movement, and wonderful laugh, simply could not resist. He closed the door behind him and even blushed with excitement. As expected from the Pink Virgin, she really has the dignified act of a famous lady from high society. It was hard for Julian to even think about her supporting the unknown daughter of Salmisi and the unknown daughter of the wealthy Tiero family. At this very time, in the estate where Adelaide lived, the maids, as always, were busy with morning cleaning. They were giving one of the rooms a good cleaning, and the maid asked the head maid if she really wanted her to move this man into such a fancy room. The girl was also surprised that for this person, the carpet and curtains also needed to be changed. All the maids fulfilled the mistress's request, but one of them said that this was not all, because they even bought her and dressed her in different clothes. And when she changed, she became even more like a noblewoman. The same maid said that since she was the eldest daughter, she could be a threat to the lady's position. But she took such loving care of her, so she really did have an incredibly broad heart. Then, suddenly, one of the maids was very surprised and told her to be careful with her words, because from now on, they had to use only respectful speech when talking to Lord Durian. Otherwise, their heads might not even be on their shoulders anymore. The servant's friends laughed and asked if she hadn't made a mistake right in front of the young lady and almost lost her head. Her friend, who also laughed, said that apparently no one even recognized her, so she was pardoned. But at that moment, a man entered the room who controlled the entire process. He turned to the maids and asked why it was so noisy, and also said that he had told them that they needed to finish everything quickly. The man also added that Sirium is a castle that has preserved the dignity of the family for generations, so even the furniture must be treated with great care. He also advised them to avoid using any brightly colored furniture that could make Lord Durian's stay in the room uncomfortable. The maids immediately said that they understood everything and would definitely do it. He then turned to a maid named Marie and Lucy, and said that Lady Harris had ordered them to dress the lady as luxuriously as possible, but the two of them must first know the lady's wishes. Some time passed since then, and when Adelaide came to Lady Harris, she was indignant and asked if her orders had not been properly conveyed. She did not understand why the girl was still wearing her morning dress and asked what kind of dust she had on the bottom of her dress. Adelaide, adjusting her outfit, said that she was just walking with Durian through the forest and garden. The girl also asked her teacher if she knew that there were a lot of snowfruit trees in their family forest. But Mrs. Harris was not interested at all. She started shouting at the girl, saying that it was very wrong to drag out her dirt in such an important place. The woman also asked, does she really want to start her etiquette lessons from the very beginning again? To which Adelaide, coming closer to her, insincerely asked for forgiveness and said that it seemed she was still far from behaving like a noblewoman. The girl also said that if she meant basic lessons, then she and Durian were just the right candidates for this. Lady Harris was incredibly angry and did not understand why this girl suddenly turned against her. Then, gritting her teeth, she said that she had already told her that the artist would arrive very soon and ask her to change into a normal dress. Adelaide at this point bowed her head and said that the artist's sudden arrival was probably on her father's orders, and Lady Harris, becoming even more angry, asked how she, knowing this, could simply take and ignore this fact. The woman also replied that she felt that she might need this stick for punishment again, since she now doesn't obey it at all. But Adelaide could now stand up for herself. She said it was very rude because she would gladly have held out her wrists as she had done as a child, but she was no longer at an age where she should be treated like that. Before leaving, she also told Mrs. Harris that she should not worry, because she would of course change. However, Durian would also accompany her. The woman, who simply couldn't stand this boy, became angry and asked what she was even talking about and why he had to be there. Adelaide suddenly stopped and said with a smile on her face, "Madam, it is incredibly rude to say such things." Turning to face her, she said that if the girl did not show respect to the young master, then she would have her own plans on how to deal with it. She also advised the woman not to repeat the same mistake again, because next time, she would not forgive her for it. Then, as if nothing had happened, the girl turned to Lucy and told her to prepare a simple but neat dress. There was no need to get out any jewelry or decorations. The maid was a little surprised, but told the lady that she would definitely do everything. After that, the two of them left. Lucy couldn't understand how this frightening tall Madame Harris could treat her mistress like that, but she also assumed that perhaps the butler knew about it and gave her special instructions. At that very moment, Adelaide, already dressed in a beautiful dress, went out onto the balcony and saw that the portrait artist had already arrived on the territory of their estate. After this, the man met the woman in the guest room and said that he was already waiting because he had brought all the materials and luggage and was ready to start work. He bowed to Durian and Adelaide, who were sitting quietly in the corner at that moment, and said that it was a great honor for him to meet the mistress of the castle and the prince. Adelaide, who was playing chess with her brother, said that he must be very tired, but also inquired why this sudden visit had been made. The man was a little surprised by this question, but immediately replied that it was an unexpected request from the head of her father's family, and he was simply obliged to fulfill it. The man handed her a bundle of paper containing the letter the man had given him, and said that her father had asked him to paint a new portrait of the girl. As he handed over this letter, he began to study the girl's appearance carefully. She had bright golden hair and purple eyes with a drop of blue. Such beauty was incredibly huge for the rural castle where she now lived with Durian, but he also didn't know if her father had really asked him to draw her in such clothes. When Adelaide took the letter in her hand, she immediately remembered it. Her father had asked her to send him as soon as possible the altered portrait she had made several years ago with the help of an experienced artist. Of course, at that time she didn't understand at all why she was doing this, and simply did what she was asked to do. The girl could not even imagine that the King of Land II could come to her after all this. Her father, who never had any money, would certainly not have hired an artist, so she assumed it was a plan hatched in conjunction with a benefactor. If Adelaide now does not want to deal with the king, then she must not allow this portrait to be painted. So the girl seriously thought about what she should do. The artist approached one of the portraits that hung on the wall and asked, was it really painted recently? And also asked who painted it, because it was simply terrible quality. The artist simply beamed with joy, realizing the fact that he could do much better, and so asked the girl to allow him to correct it immediately, and also suggested that they start immediately. Of course, Adelaide had no intention of doing this, so she simply said that there was absolutely no need for it. The artist, hearing this, was really very surprised, because he had expected to be able to work with the girl. But Adelaide only explained that she would send a letter of refusal, so he didn't have to worry about the consequences that might await him when her father found out about it. The artist was absolutely furious. He said that this simply couldn't be happening, and also suggested that she simply paint a new portrait instead of the one that was already hanging on her wall. But the girl put the letter he had given her away and said that there was no need for that either, since she had not given her consent to any of this from the very beginning. Then she looked to the side and saw how much Durian was enjoying the game of chess and was looking closely at each piece. The girl, smiling, immediately asked him if he really liked horses, and also asked if he would like to learn horse riding from the Duchess. As soon as the boy heard this, he was so surprised that he even screamed. He looked at his sister and wondered, could he really learn this too? Adelaide, laughing immediately, said that of course he could, because it would be much more interesting than history lessons. However, in turn, he would also have to attend etiquette lessons as an addition. Of course, the guy was not at all against this, because horses were his passion, and he would always like to work with them somehow, and also, of course, ride. The artist, who was watching the behavior of these two, was very surprised. He understood that he could not return completely empty-handed, so he turned to the girl. As an alternative, this man came up with the idea of drawing a family portrait, so that he would definitely not have traveled in vain. Seeing her surprised expression, he explained that even if the color was slightly different, they both had the same shine to their hair, and both of their eye colors looked like noble jewels. So the two of them looked like twin angels, like real brother and sister. Therefore, the artist, delighted, said that it would be simply a wonderful and magnificent masterpiece if the two of them were depicted on it. Of course, the man needed this incredibly, because he was even afraid to think about what would happen if he returned empty-handed. As soon as Durian heard this, he was not at all delighted. He said that he did not want a portrait, so he resisted in every possible way. Adelaide looked at the sketches that the artist had prepared and, indignantly, told the guy that she did not have a single memory of what he looked like in his youth, so she wanted to at least capture this moment. But the guy, who had already been dressed in a very luxurious uniform, continued to shout and said that he was against this portrait for Adelaide, so he did not understand at all why they wanted to paint him too. The guy kept trying to escape from the maid's hands and saying that the artist was lying only to get money, and that's why he came up with this terrible idea. The maid tried to calm the man down so she could fix his clothes properly, but he did not want to calm down and continued to resist and scream. Durian turned to his sister and said that she should not fall for these lies. They are trying to humiliate him. They will draw such a freak, just like he looks in life. As soon as Adelaide heard these words, she became angry and immediately asked what he was even saying. Then she came closer to him and, trying to calm him down, said that, of course, he was not ugly, and asked, had he never looked in the mirror? The girl also added that it was unthinkable that a cutie like him would call himself unattractive and even ugly. She smiled and said that from the top of her head to the tips of her toes, she found him so incredibly cute that she couldn't help but cry at times because of how wonderful he was. She stroked his golden hair and said that even if she collected all the beautiful and sweet words that existed in the world, they would not be enough to describe the guy. Adelaide also said that it was just a dream to touch those soft cheeks or his golden hair, which felt incredibly silky and delightful to the touch. She explained that she was also part of this family, and when people said that she was like him, it really made her happy. Of course, Durian was shocked by such words. He could not believe that everything she said was true. However, the girl at least managed to calm him down. Durian stood and simply looked at her, thinking about the word family, which never had any meaning for him. His father, who had always been a very cold master, and he had never even known his mother when he first met his sister, he couldn't even touch her because she always ignored him and distanced herself. Adelaide just remained silent, looking at his hand with a strange expression on her face. It was not cold, unkind. However, her face looked as if she was about to burst into tears at that very second. Of course, the boy thought that it was precisely because of him that she felt disgusted because he touched her. But now that she had said all these words, Durian still agreed to do it. He seemed very confident when he said that if his sister was so insistent on a family portrait, then he was ready to overcome himself and fulfill her request. Of course, he didn't know who his real sister was, but he knew it didn't matter now. He could enjoy the moments when she was kind and generous to him, so that he wouldn't regret having nothing. But at that moment, Durian turned around and said that he was warning her not to blame him if he were to spoil the portrait. The boy also asked Lucy to bring him another outfit. Of course, he doesn't want to disappoint his sister and lose this kindness that he finally found. and even if it's just a dream, he doesn't want to wake up from this dream. As soon as Adelaide heard that he agreed to her request, she immediately beamed with joy. She smiled and thanked him for it. The girl also suggested that they hurry up a little, because once they were done, they could go for a walk, and all of this would simply be left behind. At this very time in the Dawnmail mansion, which was located in the capital, Sirius was calmly sitting in his office and studying some book. Julian came to him and said that this was the day when Lady Mary was coming. So he asked why this guy was still in his office, and completely unprepared for this meeting. Sirius looked up from his book and said that it was research. So he asked the guy to leave him alone, because that was exactly what he wanted to do. His bodyguard became angry and asked, was he really saying this only because he ran away from Lady Mary? Of course, he was very hurt by the fact that Sirius tried to make a fool out of him, despite the fact that the boy had also read quite a lot of books that teach. The guy explained to Sirius that she came yesterday and would come today too. She was very sorry that she couldn't cross paths with him, so she would come all the time. However, the guy still constantly avoids this meeting and leaves the girl completely alone. Julian didn't understand at all why his master was so strange, because he didn't know how he could not like such a charming woman. And he also said that Sirius would definitely not be able to make a final choice if he did not talk to women. However, the guy, returning to reading the book, said that even if he did meet her, it would only increase the number of people he would not like. So he likes to just avoid it. When he realized that the assistant would not leave him alone, Sirius sighed heavily and said that it was not at all that he was not interested in marriage. But the more he talked about all this, the drier he became, like sand that accumulates in a forest and simply dries up. As soon as Julian heard all this, he assumed that most likely the guy was simply starting to harden due to the fact that he had been without love and any desire for so long. He also really hoped that Sirius would still be able to find a mate, because he didn't want the guy to end up in a monastery one day and he would just have to follow him. Seeing the strange expression on his assistant's face, Sirius decided to change the subject and asked, "What happened to the portrait? Where are the other candidates his father told him about?" Julian explained that Lady Mary's story had spread through high society, and Thiel's eldest daughter was also heading to the estate to meet him in person. However, the young lady from Salmia does not even intend to send them a portrait, and therefore it seems to him that she does not intend to meet Sirius.